All right, let's keep the conversation going now. We're joined by John Burns, Strategic Director at Concerned Veterans for America. Also, Raymond White joins us, former CIA Senior Field Officer.
And right here in studio, we have Ben Weingarter, Senior Contributor at The Federalist, and Alexandra Bauer, political commentator. They're standing by for reaction to the day's top stories. John, I'll start with you. So much upheaval here in the UK, this political landscape. Tell us a little bit more about this Andy Burnham, who is expected to potentially be the next Prime Minister. He was the ex-mayor of Greater Manchester. What kind of track record does he have?
I'm not 100% familiar with him. He's a British politician. Obviously, Great Britain is very much in a political crisis. You know, from everything I see, they're very much a nation in decline right now. And he really needs to work and to do his best to turn that around. You know, many folks in our administration have been quite critical. President Trump was kind of clear yesterday. Vice President Vance has had a lot to say about the decline of Europe overall. But I, for one, hope that at this opportunity that Mr. Burnham turns the country around, goes back to principles of free speech, goes back to principles of free trade, and really, you know, brings back Britain as an important part of the Western civilization, an important part of America's own history in terms of setting that kind of constitutional framework for a free society.
Yeah. One of our oldest allies, you know, set aside everything that happened in 1776, and perhaps if the U.S. soccer team plays England, then we're back rivals. But Raymond, it's important for the U.S. to have this friendly relationship with the U.K., and I think John was really pointing it out. There's frustration with those citizens about how issues of the economy are handled and also immigration. That seems to be a huge factor as to why there's so many protests that we've seen take place, lack of national pride when it comes to what's happening overseas. How are you watching this departure and really what it means?
Yeah, thanks. Good morning. Thanks for having me on. So again, as John mentioned, not a surprise here that Starmer is stepping down. I think we saw indications of that even months ago. The one factor I think that hasn't been mentioned, but yet I think is probably maybe the one that put this situation over the edge, is the counterterrorism issue. So in the last 2 months, we've seen almost a dozen cases of domestic terrorism in London, in particular against Jewish synagogues and other Jewish individuals and entities. And you know, it looks like it points back to Iran. I think that's pretty much what the evidence looks like at this point, without, of course, you know, running this case to trial or anything. So I think in terms of the economic woes, I think that all started. We were living in London, in fact, during Brexit, so I witnessed it firsthand. And Brexit was obviously a major part of this process. The British should have remained in Brexit, and secondly, should have probably renegotiated much harder with the United States, because frankly, they could have secured far greater trade policies, and the U.S. probably would have happily partnered with them to counter against Europe.
Yeah, he certainly had a lot of resistance here against President Trump. But Starmer, he isn't the only European leader here having issues. President Trump calling out Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni on Truth Social yesterday, writing this: after spending trillions in dollars on NATO, Italy and its prime minister wouldn't even think of becoming involved with the Islamic Republic of Iran and their very serious nuclear threat. For decades, we defend them, but when tested, they are not there to defend us and the rest of the world. So this is something President Trump has really been harping on here, that these allies are not coming to our help, our defense, when we need that help. Is it time, John, for us to pull out of NATO?
The situation with NATO is pretty complicated. I personally don't want NATO helping in the Mideast, unlike President Trump, but at the same time, I want NATO to focus on European security, the Mediterranean security, maybe as far east as the Red Sea, but I think after that, it becomes primarily the responsibility of nations in the region. I don't think the United States should spend a lot of time in the future in the Middle East either, but I do think it's imperative for NATO nations and for Europe as a whole to take charge of their own security. The U.S. has been there and will remain there as a support, but it's been there for too long, too deeply involved, spending too much money. And the Europeans have the economic and the industrial capability and, frankly, the military capability to defend their nations if they want to. But they are relying on the United States and the U.S. government and the U.S. military to continue to do that. And they're doing it, you know, at a cost to Americans to advantage their own citizens.
Yeah. And again, part of this drama with Georgia Maloney has to do with apparently a photograph that she had requested to be with President Trump. And she's saying that she didn't beg him for a photograph, and now it's back and forth. It's totally invented. Either way, why are we having dramatic moments when clearly there are greater issues when we're talking about NATO and European countries contributing to NATO resources and supporting allies like Ukraine in its fight against Russia, plus dealing with Iran? There's so much to get to. It's not so much the photo ops that perhaps people should be worried about, but, you know, they're politicians at the end of the day. Raymond, let's talk about what's happening in Iran. We heard from Vice President J.D. Vance earlier on this program. Here's what he had to say about Lebanon's impact on peace talks.
Well, we want Israel's security to be protected, and we also want Lebanon's sovereignty to be protected, and this is going to be an ongoing conversation. The Israelis have been very clear they do not have territorial intentions on South Lebanon. The reason they feel they have to be there is because they're worried about Hezbollah fighters in South Lebanon firing into Israel.
All right, so Raymond, considering that, can a full deal really come to fruition if you've still got all these Iranian proxies fighting against Israel?
So that's a great question, in fact. I think the answer in the short term is probably no. I think in the long term, the answer is yes. Ultimately, I had to laugh because I read this morning that the Iranian officials were essentially saying that, you know, they put the onus on Israel and put the onus on the United States for Lebanon and for Hezbollah. The fact remains, Iran supports Hezbollah, not only in Lebanon, but as most of your viewers may not know, in Venezuela as well. They have a huge command and control infrastructure and fundraising apparatus there. Wow. So if anything's going to happen, that's really the domino that needs to fall. Iran needs to not follow its own agenda. They need to essentially cave on this one. They need to do what the U.S. is asking, which is stop funding Hezbollah, stop inciting Hezbollah, and stop getting Hezbollah to incite Israel. Otherwise, peace is not going to happen. It's literally going to be probably the cog in the wheel for this whole entire arrangement.
John, what do you make of Israel not being part of these talks in Switzerland? And we do know that there's been that contention there between Lebanon and Israel. We have troops based in Lebanon right now to try to protect that state. What do you think is going to happen? Is this going to actually come together? There's this 60-day negotiation, but I mean, Israel's a big part of it.
Well, I hope the 60-day negotiation succeeds. The war should come to an end. Hezbollah is one of the two main sticking points. The other one being the disposition of the uranium. It's clearly and becoming clearer and clearer that the U.S. and Israel do not share exactly the same interests here, particularly the American people versus the Israeli government, right? The American people want to see this war come to an end. Prime Minister Netanyahu's government wants to see Hezbollah destroyed. And of course, it's in the Iranians' interest to try and link the two together, right? They would like to see Hezbollah survive an onslaught from Israel. They would like to divide U.S. and Israel and not have the U.S. support any efforts against Hezbollah or any of their other proxies. So it's a sticky wicket. It's a tight knot. But it's, it's under kind of the dominion, the negotiations of folks like J.D. Vance to figure this out. I think the vice president's doing a good job, and we have to continue to de-link our interests from the Israeli interests, to de-link what we want to see happen between the United States, Iran, and the region around the Gulf versus what's going on between Israel and Lebanon. All while respecting our alliance with Israel and respecting the territorial integrity of Lebanon.
Yeah, striking the balance, right? Easier, so much easier said than done. Raymond White and John Burns, thanks so much for joining us here on First Edition. Appreciate it.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Have a great.
Thank you.